worship this morning. We, 5th to 6th grade, you guys can, well, you're heading out also to your community group. See ya. That'll help a little bit. We've got some coming in. There's some space around, so if you've got some room next to you, if you wouldn't mind squeezing in, we still have some people coming in. And you can see why we need a third service and why we're introducing a second service on Sunday morning. And September 9th, we'll be doing that. So look forward to those times that are coming. I want to remind us where we're at. We're in a series on the three pillars of our church. We're kind of in between our studies of James and moving into the study of Malachi. And we are doing a short series on the three pillars of our church. This is maybe a little bit more of our methodology for ministry and what we do and how we do things around here. So last week we looked at biblical teaching, and today we're looking at family discipleship. That would be another pillar of our church. And I want to make sure I give this caveat before we dive in and dig into this. When we say family discipleship, we are not just speaking about individual family units. So I need those of you who are single again, empty nesters, to not tune out this morning. This is also for our entire church, and so we mean a lot more than just individual family units when we talk about this, and it's important for us to understand that. So we've been working to better define our pillars, and this is how we define family discipleship. Family discipleship, ultimately for us, is about leading the whole family of God. That would be all of us, you, everyone, leading the whole family of God to love God with every fiber of their being, with intentional focus on equipping individual families in order to pass down the faith to future generations. So we want to equip the entire family of God, lead the entire family of God, our church, us, to love God with every fiber of our being. We just sang about it. Jesus, you're all that I need. We want you to believe that, not just sing songs about that. We want you to understand that and find your satisfaction in Him and nothing else. And we understand that when you are shaped by the gospel, when the church is shaped by the gospel, it will lead into proclamation. It has to. When you understand the greatness of God and His grace towards us, you cannot help but talk about it. And we want our church to fall in love with Him and never stop talking about it. And we're going to give special attention, specific attention, to individual families, equipping them so that all of us together can pass on the faith to the next generation. So this morning, our primary text we're going to be looking at is Deuteronomy 6, 4-9. That is where we get this idea of these three aspects of this pillar. So if you want to turn there with me, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4-9, I'll read it for us. Verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down. And when you rise, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So this morning we're going to see those three aspects of this pillar that we're talking about, and we're going to unpack these further. We can see it in this text here. We're going to look at the family of God. We want to first lead the family of God, us, our church, to love God with every fiber of our being. And then in this text, it also is addressing individual families, and then ultimately for the purpose of passing on the faith to the next generation. And so this is for all of us. It is not just for parents. It is for the entire church. And so let's look at this first idea, the family of God, and understand it a little bit better. We see that Moses is addressing this in verses 4-6. It's important for us to understand the context of these verses. This is known as the Shema, and faithful Jews would have recited this twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. And this is taught, this is proclaimed, these are the words of God through Moses to the nation of Israel. The nation, the entire people of Israel. And it's right before They're about to enter the promised land. And one of the things that God is concerned about is that they remember all of his greatness and grace towards them. And he says nearly 18 times in the first 6 chapters, lest you forget. So there's this command that all of us understand who God is, what God's done, what he's done in our life, and understand the grace of God, lest we forget. It's for everyone. It is not just for one specific set of people. And so before Moses addresses specific families, he addresses the entire nation. He understands that they must love God with all of their hearts if the next generation ever has any hope of a loving God. We must love God with all of our hearts if there is ever any hope of the next generation loving him with all of their hearts. And I think it's important before we dig into the specific verses here, we need to have a quick theology of marriage and family. So in Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28, the family is the first institution created. Before the church, before Israel was ever established, the family was created. And the Bible begins with a family and ends with a family. And it's important for us to understand. In Genesis 1, 27 and 28, it says, So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So real quickly, to understand this idea of family and a basic theology of family is to understand that God established the family. The family is not something that man came up with. Marriage is not something that we constructed on our own. God orchestrated it. And theologians say there's really 3 primary goods of marriage and family. One is a relational good. It's a relational good. Now, I know when we read this, we think about Genesis chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, where it says that God speaks to Adam and says it's not good for you to be alone. And there is a relational dynamic or a relational component to marriage, but it's not strictly about us. And when we misunderstand that, we miss the purpose and the reason for marriage and family. Because it was about a relationship, but it was more about displaying a relationship. So the relational good that God intended is certainly there's a benefit horizontally for us to have a relationship and be in partnership and relational community. But the primary reason is to display a relationship. To display God's relationship with man. So when we look at marriage and family, we begin to see a picture of the gospel. We begin to see God's covenant faithfulness to us. And so there's a relational good, a display of relational good. It's also a procreational good. This is not something that Mars Hill Fairhope has a problem with. We understand this very well by the 200 children that are downstairs, right? Procreational good. But again, this is not just about having kids so that we can have cute little cuddly babies to hold on to. It's not strictly about us. Christopher Ashe, he wrote a book called Marriage, Sex, and the Service of God. Sounds like a book we'd all love to read, right? It is a great book. It's an excellent book, and he asks this question. How does having children serve God? I love his answer. Here's his answer. The answer is that it may or may not serve God. It really depends on the children. It's not simply enough to bring new human beings into the world. It is also necessary for them to grow into a relationship of glad response to the call of God. So having children is not simply about us having something to hold and cuddle with. It's about us passing on the faith, passing on, it's fulfilling the creation and the cultural mandate of Genesis chapter 1 to fill the earth, to be fruitful and multiply, more and more God worshipers. More and more people that say, He is great and I'm not. So there's a purpose to this procreational good. And again, it's not about us. And then there's this last good that many say when they speak about marriage and family, about the goods that it provides that God intended. It's the societal good. It doesn't take long to turn on the news. It doesn't take long to pay attention. It doesn't take long to even look at our own hearts to understand how messed up marriages and families are in our culture today. It doesn't take long to figure this out. And everything, if we sat down and spent 5 minutes listing all of the ways that marriage and family are broken in our culture today, and even our own lives and even in our own church, what we begin to understand is that Genesis 1 and 2 and the way that God intended it to be was intended to curb most of those things. Christopher Ash says that marriage as God intended to be was intended to curb the sexual chaos of our day. And so it provides a societal good or a boundary for which all life and everything was intended to be experienced. So families were established to provide all of this, and what's interesting is because of Genesis chapter 3, the fall, everything's broken, including marriage and family. You don't have to go far. Genesis chapter 3 shows the first marital fight. You can see it in the text. They're blaming each other. It's what we experience every day, right? And so it happens immediately that there's this fragmentation of our relationships, and there's a brokenness to all it is that God intended. But God immediately begins to work to redeem and rescue the hearts of men, and what he does is he goes about this redemption process through a family. So it begins with a family, he works through a family, and it ends with a family. How do we see this? In Genesis chapter 12, here's the verse on the screens. He identifies Abraham, and listen to the text. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you or by you or through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. He's pointing forward to the future day when the Redeemer will come by a family to redeem people and call them into a new family, so that all the families of the earth would be blessed through him. Genesis 18 shows us his specific intent. For I have chosen him, Abraham, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. So his call of Abraham is to establish a new family, a new people that honors and celebrates and worships him, adores him with all of their heart, loves him with every fiber of their being. And that's what leads us to Deuteronomy chapter 6. But it's important for us to understand, God is not just trying to establish a new nation state. He's not just trying to establish this new Middle Eastern family. He is working to establish a new people, all together, wholly devoted to him. And this is where we read through the New Testament, we begin to understand this. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says that God is working through Jesus to create one new man, reconciling us to God and bringing peace to one another. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15. What is Paul saying? Through Jesus, Genesis chapter 3 is righted, is corrected. The fragmentation of families and friends and relationships in the world is restored and righted. It's rewoven in Jesus. We're reconciled to God and we're reconciled to one another. An important text for this week and next week when we talk about authentic community is in 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. 2 Peter chapter, there it is, awesome. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. Says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. Verse 10, don't miss it. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That in Jesus we are called out of darkness into light, out of death into life, out of individualism and isolation and into a new family. And you're looking at it. And we're only one segment of the universal church of God. And so he's establishing this new man, this new people, so that, Revelation chapter 19, we all might have a grand family reunion around the throne of Jesus, the marriage supper of the Lamb, as he redeems and calls forward his bride, the church. The Bible begins with a family and ends with a family. And this is what Moses is teaching here and calling here and reminding here in Deuteronomy 6:5. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, with all your emotions, with all your body, with all your mind, with every ounce of who you are." You're intended to love God with all of yourself, fully devoted and enthralled with God. Does that feel like you this morning? Does that feel like you every moment of every day? No, it doesn't often feel that way. It doesn't often feel that way. But God through Moses is calling the nation of Israel, the people of God, to be enthralled with God. To bring our lives in orbit around God. To honor him and celebrate him and be enamored with him at all times and all places with everything that we are. Now, this often does not feel like who we are. We face tragedy. We face trials. We face circumstances that crush us every day. And sometimes I just don't feel like serving and worshiping and celebrating God at all times and all moments. And Moses provides the motive. He skips ahead. If you skip ahead in verses 10 through 13, he says, "And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear." What's Moses doing? What's God reminding his people? I did not have to be gracious to Adam and Eve. You ever notice in Genesis chapter 3, when they rebel against him, they're not absolutely crushed. Instead, they're provided covering, and they're cast out of the garden. There's a separation between them and God, but they're not crushed. That's grace. Moses is reminding the people here, I didn't have to choose Abraham. I didn't have to be gracious to him. I didn't have to establish you, Israel. I didn't have to call you out of Egypt and out of slavery. I didn't have to provide you with this promised land flowing with milk and honey. I didn't have to give you the cisterns. I didn't have to give you the food. I didn't have to do any of this stuff, but I did it because I love you. Because I want you. Because you're my child. I did it because of grace. And Moses is reminding the people of God to remember all that God had done for them, his greatness and his great grace towards them. And that's the motivator that moves us to worship, that moves us to celebrate, that moves us to say, I can't stop talking about this. It's so beautiful. It's so wonderful. I cannot believe how gracious he's been to me. What we see is that grace is the ultimate motivator. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 6, Moses says, "And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart." In Old Testament anthropology, understanding of man, the heart is where the intellect was located, the mind. So it ought to be on your mind always. The commands of God ought to be on your mind always. The grace of God ought to be on your mind always. His goodness towards you ought to be on your mind always. Don't stop thinking about it. Don't stop meditating on it. Don't stop dwelling on it. Don't stop celebrating it, because the more you meditate on it, the more you focus on his, as we sang, steadfast faithfulness, the more you meditate on his greatness towards you, his grace towards you, the more it changes you, the more it melts your heart, and the more it moves you to talk about it and to tell others about it and to pass it down to the next generation. Moses is reminding the people of this. If the commands of God, the truth of God, an intimate relationship to Jesus is not part of your life, it is not likely to be part of the next generation. We're reminded in this text that if it's not part of our life, if it's not first about our heart, he says it must be on your mind, your heart. If it's not on your heart, it will never be on their heart. It's important for us to remember that the gospel must first be something we understand, that we are transformed by, that we apply, that we live out, if we ever expect them, the next generation, to live it out. So when I was at the University of Mobile, I spent 20 years serving one generation. One generation. They were born 1980 to 2000. This first senior class of that generation was 1998. I started discipling guys in 1998 in the first senior class of the millennial generation, and then just last May, shared the gospel with a whole intern and senior class of the university. And so over that time span, somehow someone thought, hey, it'd be good to get this guy to go speak places and talk about the millennial generation. And I got really burnt out talking about the millennial generation, not bashing them, but listening to people bash them. And here's the thing. I literally sat with a pastor one day. One of our trustees brought his pastor in, and the pastor sat down across from my desk, and he said, hey, tell me what we need to do. Everybody's talking about millennial generation leaving the church. What do we need to do? And he says this to me. I'm dressing with my shirt untucked. We've got the lights, and I just don't understand why they're not coming. I'm not making that up. And I said, dear brother, pastor, reverend, sir, can I suggest to you that maybe one reason they're not enamored with Jesus is because you're not enamored with Jesus? Maybe one reason they don't love marriage as a portion of the gospel is because they haven't seen a marriage worth dying for? Maybe one reason they don't submit to ultimate authority is because they don't see their parents submitting to any kind of authority? Maybe it's us. Maybe it's not them. Maybe we need to be turning the spotlight away from them and focusing on our own hearts. And that's what Moses is doing here. Focus the gospel spotlight on your heart before you focus it on them. It is about our hearts. And I promise, as your heart is melted by the gospel, they will begin to see something different in your life, in your marriage, in our church, and it will be absolutely attractive. I hate that word, but it will be absolutely attractive. They will be drawn to it. They will be absolutely drawn to it. I love what, I would highly recommend this book to everyone, the Gospel Parenting by William Farley. He says it this way. We change their hearts by teaching the gospel, modeling the gospel, and centering our homes on the gospel. The gospel, rightly understood and modeled, makes Christianity attractive. Effective parents make the gospel so attractive that the world cannot get a foothold in their child's heart. I would add that effective churches model the gospel, live the gospel, understand the gospel in such a way that the body can't. The world can't have a foothold in the body of Christ either. And when that begins to happen, it begins to affect families, it begins to affect the parenting, it begins to affect our children. And that's where it starts. It starts there. The good news of the gospel, I know some of you are feeling like you're complete failures this morning. The good news of the gospel is first, it's a matter of your heart. The other good news of the gospel is that there's hope for redemption. That there's hope for where all those moments and all those times that we failed. This is what Farley also says. If you could parent perfectly, your children might not need a savior. If you could parent perfectly, your children might not need a savior. And I would add, and you might not need a savior. But the very fact that you can't parent perfectly shows you your need for the gospel. And your need for Jesus. And your need for the strength that the gospel can only provide. And when we begin to lean into that, and we begin to meditate on that, and we begin to allow it to shape our hearts, it cannot but influence our families, our spouses, our children, our church. I love what he says, that it's by meditating on, modeling, centering our lives around the good news of God's greatness and his grace towards us in Jesus. That we are transformed, our church is transformed, families are transformed, and the next generation is transformed. So what practical steps can we take? The first is to repent. Not a word we love, but it's to repent. To say, God, I've been trying to do this all by myself. I've been trying to do this in my own strength, but it's not by my strength. It's by Jesus. It's by the gospel. I need him. I need his help. I need his wisdom. It's by stopping the process of worshiping our kids over God. We worship everything, creation over the Creator in every way. So it's not just kids, but we happen to do it a lot with our kids. It's by reorienting our hearts and our lives to God and to his greatness and his grace towards us over and against our kids. Some of you are saying, I don't feel like loving him with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind. Psalm 77 would be a great psalm for you to read and meditate. The psalmist says in verse 3, when I remember God, I moan. That's not good. Like, that's discouraging. When I meditate, my spirit faints. When I think about God, I just, But what's his mechanism, his method, his means for escaping that depression? Verses 10 to 12. Then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. What's he meditating on? God's steadfast faithfulness in years past. To find himself liberated from the situation that he's in this moment. Psalm 95, great psalm. It is the premier psalm on worship. And worship overflows from meditating on God's greatness. Psalm 95, verses 3 to 6. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountains are also his. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. What moves him to worship? Thinking about how infinitely great God is and how gracious he's been towards him. Psalm 78. Why would you ever, the great psalm on passing it down to the next generation, why would we ever tell the next generation? Psalm 78. We will not hide them from their children, the commands, the great teachings of God, but tell to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. And it says, so that they might put their hope in him. I will not stop focusing on how great he is and how gracious he's been towards me. And it will move me and motivate me to declare it, to talk about it. Over and over again we see this. If we're going to pass on the faith, the people of God have to fall in love with God, be enthralled by his grace, and not stop talking about it. Point 2, individual families. I hope you're not discouraged. Oh my gosh, how's he going to finish in time? Individual families. Individual families. We want to lead the family of God to be enthralled with him, to love God with every fiber of their being, and we want to give specific attention to families. Why? Because parents, you are the primary influencers of your child's faith. You are the primary influencers. One commentator says this: once the commands of God are upon the heart of an individual, there's an imperative to pass on what has been learned to the next generation. This is what Moses says in verses 7 through 9. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. A couple of quick observations here. He's addressing Israel and parents. Find the word parents in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 to 9. It's not there, because he's addressing the entire nation. So I don't want to belabor the point, but it's all of our responsibility to raise my daughter. Good luck. It's all of our responsibility. It's my primary responsibility, but I need your help. I need you to prop up my arms. I need you to help me. I need you to encourage me. I need you to walk with me. I need you to challenge me. I need you to say, stop being stupid. I need you to tell me to keep going, push me back into the fight. It's all of our responsibility. Implied in the text is that it's the parent's primary responsibility. He says in verse 7, you shall teach them diligently to your children. It's Israel and parents. It's clearly implied in the text. It's important for you to know that you are the primary influencer, not the church, not the pastor, not everyone else. It's you as the primary influencer. Christian Smith wrote a book. He did a research project, 3,000 18 to 23-year-olds across the nation, and he measured it's called Souls in Transition. It's on the emerging faith of the next generation, and he did this study on 3,000 18 to 23-year-olds. And of the 3,000 18 to 23-year-olds, he gives these 35 characteristics of their emerging faith and the struggles that they face. But the number one influencer that every single one of them said was the determiner or the influencer on their faith was parents. Parents. They were the primary influencers on young adult faith. And for those that wandered, he found that the emerging adults, these 18 to 23-year-olds, said their parents were either distant, tried to be their best friend and not the adult, or seemed not to care. One of those three things negatively influenced them. And we wonder, why do parents do this? Why do parents abandon? Why do parents try to be the best friend? Why do they seem to not care? Because it's far too easy to bow to the emotional reactions of our child rather than be the adult and stand our ground on foundational commitments to truth. It's far too easy to listen to them during their adolescent years when they say things like, Mom, I can't stand you. Mom, I don't want you in my life. Get away from me. It's far too easy for us to say, well, I want them to like me. I want them to love me. So either I'll back off on the authority or I'll try to be the best friend or something else. Instead, what's desperately needed and what they want, I promise you, what they want is it for us to be the adults, for us to remember that what they want is not always what they need, and for us to love them despite themselves. And when we do those things, we are modeling the gospel. When we stand as the adult, the ultimate authority, what are we doing? We're modeling that there is an ultimate authority over all of life. When we remind them that what they want is not always what they need, we're modeling the gospel, and what they need is grace and love despite themselves. And this is what Smith's research echoed. Another observation of 7 to 9. Teach and etch. This is important. You shall teach them diligently to your children. That phrase, teach them diligently, it means persistent, painstaking work. Persistent, painstaking work. It's difficult. And it can actually, the original language actually means like to carve. To carve something in stone. Chip away. Every day, every night, all the time, always. With the truths of the gospel. That's actually what the word character means. It means to be engraved in stone. Think about this. What if you did this day and night for years and years and years and years and years? You would have a masterpiece at the end. This is exactly what Michelangelo did with the statue of David. It is one of the world's most beautiful pieces of art. He was asked to create this huge statue, and previous artists passed on this big block of granite, 25 feet tall, saying it had too many faults, too many flaws. Michelangelo said, oh, I'll take it. And he chipped away for 2 straight years. Day and night, chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. And look at the intricacy on that. This is what Michelangelo did. Imagine if we did this persistently in this painstaking work over time with our children, teaching them the gospel, teaching them the word. It doesn't mean everything's going to always work out perfectly, but it is what we're called to do. And then he also says, as you go. As you go. Deuteronomy 6:7. Teach them diligently as you go, and talk about these things when you sit, when in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. When you sit and when you rise, when you sit and when you walk, when you lie down and when you rise, he says teach diligently and then also lie down. What's he talking about? Inactivity and activity, evening and morning, formal and informal, always, everywhere, all the time, constantly be looking for opportunities to point them to God, to teach them about the gospel. The point is that the greatness of God, the grace of God, the commands of God are always on our minds and therefore always on our lips and therefore are at a higher percentage chance of being on their lips. And that's what Moses is challenging us. Don't stop meditating on it. Don't stop appropriating it. Don't stop talking about it, proclaiming it, walking in it, living in it. Rehearse God's mighty deeds in your own heart, in your own mind, and celebrate it with them. You're going to hear in 2 weeks a little bit more detail about how we do this, but some of the ways that we do this or encourage this are through things called faith talks. This is just simply having conversations, having a dinner together, having a conversation about what you heard on Sunday or what you heard in community group or what you are learning or what you are learning, and talking about it and just having these conversations. Another is God moments. On the back of your I don't know what we call those things, the weekly. On the back of that, there's a story, there's a God story. It's celebrating a God moment, something God's doing in the life of our church. It's looking for those moments. One of our pastors was telling, we were talking about pastor's community this week, one of our pastors was talking about this time when he first got into ministry as a youth pastor, and he was only getting paid $13,000, not much has changed, but he got paid $13,000, and they were out of food, their family was out of food. And they prayed on a Friday night as a family with 3 kids, and they said, God, please provide. On Sunday, somebody invited them to go to lunch, to come to lunch at their home. And they pointed out, hey, look, God's answering our prayer to their kids. That's a God moment. That little thing is reminding them how good and great God is towards us. And then when they got home, there were 6 bags of groceries on their front porch. And the oldest son said, where'd all these come from? And the mom perceptively took the moment to say, remember what we prayed on Friday? God answers prayer. God provides for our needs. What is she doing in that moment? She's reminding their child to look to him for all their needs and provision. It's a God moment. We do this through milestone celebrations, parent resources, parent summits. There's a whole bookcase downstairs with dozens of books that we'd highly recommend. At the end of the day, it's about us understanding the gospel and living it out. And why? It's for future generations. It's because our concern is to be obedient to the text, but also to be obedient to pass on the faith. It's from beginning to end. Why do we do this? Because we've been commanded to pass on our faith to the next generation. It's rooted in Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. We looked at it. The command is echoed in Abraham's instruction in Genesis 18. We looked at it. It's echoed again and amplified again here in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And why? Because they're about to walk into a land of plenty and a land of distraction. And in that place, God's primary concern is that they not forget him and all that he's done for them. So remember, recognize his grace towards you. It's echoed in Psalm 78. It's echoed in Psalm 145, verse 4. One generation shall commend your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts. And it's declared in Matthew 28 by Jesus when he tells us to go therefore and disciple, make disciples, teaching them everything that I commanded. That is not strictly a great commission for outside these walls. It is, but it's also for inside these walls. It's also for inside families. My greatest responsibility, and I take it with joy, is to disciple my daughter, to lead her to love Jesus. How am I going to do that? By pointing her to him, by modeling what we've talked about this morning. But I can't do it alone. I need a community of faith to come around me to help. And you need that. We need that. So let us be committed to discipling the family of faith. Let us be committed to helping families in our midst. and all so that we can proclaim the gospel to the next generation.